Our next panel discussion is on risk assessment and safer gambling tools and design. The panel will be moderated by Christina Thakor-Rankin. A number of tools have been developed to assess the risk associated with specific gambling products. This session will highlight the key issues around detecting behavioral risk using behavioral tracking, and what does the latest research indicate? How can we mitigate product risk in gambling? Ms. Rankin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. Just before we go into it, I have to say I listen into a lot of these kind of safer gambling and problem gambling conferences and events, and congratulations to the NBA. This is definitely one of the best ones I've been having the privilege of listening to and contributing for a long time.
Thank you.
Are the final panel. You're very welcome, and I mean that most genuinely. Thank you very much for the opportunity to actually moderate a panel, which I'm hoping will bring together all of the things that have been discussed during the course of this conference today. We are all very familiar about some of the kind of standard tools, such as deposit limits, reality checks, self-exclusion, etc. As we start to take the discussion from supporting problem gamblers to minimizing harm, early detection, intervention, it is an absolute honor to be able to introduce and moderate a panel which has two of the world's best experts, in my opinion, in this particular area. Unfortunately, Dr. Richard Wood is unable to join us today. Good news is, it gives us a little bit more time with Dr. Jonathan Parke and Dr. Michael Auer, who are both specialists in their fields. We're going to start the session with Dr. Michael talking us through some of the kind of things we're looking to explore in terms of behavioral analytics. We will then hand over to Dr. Richard, who's going to start to tell us about one of the newer kind of applications in minimizing harm, which is how can we put in protections around the actual design of the product itself. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Michael, who's going to give a little bit of information about himself and share some of the exciting work he's been looking at doing in terms of behavioral analysis. Dr. Michael.
All right. Thanks for the introduction. I hope you can hear me.
Certainly can.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. All right. So the presentation, is somebody pulling up the presentation too? Yeah. All right. Okay. Perfect. So I will try to talk about, player tracking, AI, tools. I like ways to analyze the benefits of basically analyzing the data which naturally come along in online gambling. And I will just try to go beyond early risk detection of problematic gambling, but introduce a few other areas that you might be interested, which could be positively affected by player tracking. So I'm from neccton, so that's an Austrian company, and as you already see, these days, we talk about safer gambling, we talk about the benefits of player tracking, not only for responsible gambling, but other areas like anti-money laundering and fraud, where you often see very similar patterns, and often, of course, players who might have trouble might be looking for other ways to sort of feed their gambling, and then naturally we see fraudulent or patterns or AML patterns. So I've published a few studies in the area of player tracking about limit settings, self-exclusions, self-report information, personalized feedback. So basically everything that could be sort of analyzed, optimized, could benefit from analytics, from data science, from AI. So here, for example, we try to find out, is it possible to predict limit settings. So let's say you could sort of anticipate, you could predict whether a player players are likely to change the limit. Then, of course, an operator could apply such algorithms, such predictions to nudge players into a certain direction. So somebody might look like they are going to change the limit, but they wouldn't do it without being nudged in a certain direction. And that's what you can use AI or data science for too. Because you have the data, the operator has the data, has the historic data, they know who changed limits, increased, decreased limit at certain points of time. And then they can use that data to train the algorithm to sort of learn a pattern of those players who are more likely to increase or decrease limits. So topics, and of course that list is not complete, that can be looked at from an analytical point of view, are voluntary limit setting. So I would estimate that most like real world studies with actual players from actual sites have been published around voluntary limit setting. Then we have mandatory play breaks, where you block somebody for a certain period of time because they showed like excessive gambling. Personalized feedback, when you inform players about the gambling, either with numbers or charts, you show them how much they lost won, or you really present text messages telling them, okay, we have observed that your, for example, depositing behavior has increased lately. Pop-up messages are a form of personalized feedback. The only difference is they appear sort of on the screen in real time. Prediction algorithms, and then mandatory play breaks. That's basically very similar to point number 2. So here we published a study, Dr. Griffiths, who was just on before me, and myself in 2012. And what we did is, so we were interested whether players actually stop to gamble when they are presented with a pop-up message. And in that case, players who had been gambling for an hour, like casino games, and in that case, the operator couldn't measure the playing time, so they used 1,000 consecutive games as a proxy measure for 1 hour of consecutive gambling. Because so in an hour, if you play the slots consecutively, you can play 1,000 games, and then a pop-up disappeared. And we found that very few players actually just, in this case, you see this here in the chart on the left-hand side, it was 75 players, and I think 7.64% of players who saw this pop-up message actually stopped to gamble. So the impact was very low, right? So out of 1,000 players, maybe 6 players stopped to gamble once they saw this pop-up message. We changed the pop-up message in terms of the wording. We introduced normative feedback. We said, okay, very few players play as often, as long as you do. And we managed to double basically the percentage of players who stopped after seeing this pop-up message. You see this here, the blue line compared to the red line, but still just 1.39% of players stopped to gamble once they saw the pop-up message. So out of 1,000 players, it was maybe 15 or 16 players who stopped to gamble. The rest continued to gamble, ignored the pop-up message. So now a lot of jurisdictions, they introduce mandatory personalized feedback. So they introduce requirements that sort of operators need to show players how much they won, lost once they log in, or they have to put this information into a certain section. And why this is actually necessary? It's necessary because we found when you ask players how much they lost and you compare it to the actual gambling, there is a large bias. So there is often players underestimate the losses and they overestimate the winnings. So, of course, how can they be aware of their own gambling? How can they sort of prevent overspending when they lose control? And that's also, of course, logical and understandable. If you play slots or any other high event frequency game, you easily can lose track of how often you spun, how often you deposited. So that's, I would say, a basic requirement nowadays, that an operator provides feedback to players in a very easy, understandable way, numerically as well as visually. The next study that I want to talk about is mandatory play breaks. So a lot of jurisdictions require operators to introduce play breaks. So let's say somebody has been gambling for 60 minutes, then it's not just a pop-up message, but it's really a play break. So they are shut off, they are blocked for, let's say, 5 minutes or 90 seconds. But so far, until we published this other study down there, and there is one study which was accepted, which will be published very soon, hopefully in a couple of weeks, and that's the study I'm talking about. We really tried to figure out, do play breaks actually help, and how long does it have to be? So we tried 90 seconds, 5 minutes, and 15 minutes, and we tried to find out, okay, when do players basically come back immediately? So our sort of evaluation criteria, how long does it take for somebody after the play break to come back and gamble again? And we found that most players come back after a 90-second or 5-minute play break. So it seems they just wait until the play break is over and they start to gamble again. Only when the play break lasts for 15 minutes, players seem to really change activity, go do something else, and sort of not come back immediately after the play break is over. So that was one learning for us, and the Norwegian Lottery, who sort of did this study together with us, they then immediately introduced this 15-minute play break after a consecutive gambling session of 60 minutes. So here you see a concrete example, and that sort of relies on actual data from actual operators. It's a real experimental study with a lot of analytics in it. And another study that we're just working on, and the data have been collected, was done with another operator. And what they actually did is, so they decided after a player deposits 10 times on a day, a 60-minute play break will be activated. So somebody who deposits 10 times since midnight, they can't deposit, they can't play for 60 minutes. And the question is here, do they actually simply come back after those 60 minutes, deposit again, or do they change activity? And what you see here is, on the x-axis, you see basically the days that we collected data from. That's from July 23rd to September 15 this year. And you see here until August 20, there was no play break. So that's basically our control period. So here we see what percent of players deposit an 11th, a 12th, etc. time, and there is no play break. And then on August 20, the play break started, and we see immediately that the percentage of players who deposit once more after the 10th deposit, after the 60 minutes, drops significantly. So here we see, again, very specific effect. If there is a 60-minute play break, basically the percent of players who continue to deposit drops from 70 to about 30%. And they also don't come back the very next, immediately after the play break. That's what you see here. I won't go into detail here, but what we've been looking at here was whether actually players sort of gamble more if they lost a lot before this play break or won a lot. Because there are, of course, some researchers assumed that players might sort of chase after the losses. So let's say you gamble a lot, you deposit, you have lost a lot, they cut you off, then you just wait to be able to gamble again, to win back basically those losses from before. But neither in that study nor in the study before we saw any behavior similar to that. We didn't see players who lost a lot come back and gamble more after they had been shut down basically proactively by the system. So I will skip that one because I believe I have 10 minutes for this presentation. And in summary, I just wanted to sort of shed some light on other areas apart from early harm or risk detection that can be assisted with analytics, with data science, and really embedded by operators into the site and really benefit players and help prevent overspending. Thank you.
Dr. Michael, that is absolutely fascinating. Just before we move on to Dr. Jonathan, may I ask you, just with the example with PlayOjo and the kind of intervention and the enforced breaks after a number of deposit limits, do you believe, obviously the statistics show that it is effective for that operator, but do you think that we need to have everybody across the industry applying the same standard for it to be truly effective, knowing that, one customer can have anything up to 5+ online accounts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're touching on a good point here. The single customer view. customers having multiple accounts. And of course, it's not just that, I mean, different jurisdictions ask for different requirements, so that the framework basically around the cornerstones are different across jurisdictions. That's why we always try to apply, or test our systems, our research in different areas, like, for example, Norway compared to the UK, compared to Germany, where now you can only deposit €1,000 a month, right? What's happening there? Now we monitor a number of operators who just sort of went live in the Netherlands, and we see like very interesting patterns happening here. But I think one thing that we found, especially from that research, is if there is a play break, it really has to be longer than 5 minutes. I think that sort of applies, in general. So I'm confident to make that statement.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, that's a lovely segue into the next session. You've talked very much upon what operators can do. We're now going to hear from Dr. Jonathan about the people who maybe are responsible for developing the product that is accessible to a number of operators. On that note, Dr. Jonathan, may I please welcome you to the session?
Thanks, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can, sir. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. So good afternoon. My name's Jonathan Parke. I am director of Sophro, which is a consultancy that does research and education in the area of safer gambling. Specifically at the minute, though, we're looking at product risk right today. And just to link up what Michael's just been talking about, it's almost looking at the other side of the coin. So Michael was looking at assessing specific markers of behavioral harm to target interventions and interactions. And that's not always, but largely regardless of player behavior. In this situation, we're targeting the specific product or features of a product to understand the source and the magnitude of the risk in order to potentially make some changes, and that's regardless of the behavior of the player. So they're both quite different. And so the brief but broad overview of some of the issues that relate to product risk assessment. Context, let's consider some of the main risk. And I guess it's fairly obvious in saying it's the extent to which a product is likely to increase the risk of gambling harm among its participants. But I think it's important to consider that it's not just the game, but also the platform and the feature. I think a lot of experts, and I know that it was included in the UK, focusing more on product is partly to do with what is generally perceived by some parties as irresponsible gambling. At least in terms of the published evidence, that they don't.
Gosh, apologies. We appear to have lost Dr. Jonathan there. Michael, are you still on standby to be able to perhaps just fill in a little?
Yeah, but I can talk through Jonathan's slides.
Fine. You don't need to go solo.
I'm totally with Jonathan that for a very long time, the focus has purely been on the player, right? On the the gambling patterns, what are, indications of problematic play. But sort of the product itself, I mean, the drug, if you want, right, has received very little attention. And there is very little sort of actual data-driven research into the different aspects of structural characteristics and impacts on problem gambling, right? Most of the research that has been published so far is based on expert opinions or maybe player panels. But we all know that the games are very complex, right? And nowadays, games in terms of the math might be very similar. So if you look at, let's say, 1,000 slot games, then they are very similar in terms of, you know, event frequency, RTP, etc., but it's totally other features, like, is there a bonus game? You know, what can you collect in that game? What theme? Is it like Egyptian? Is it about the Wild West? Is it about animals? Those things are important. Then, yeah, I mean, and that's, of course, game designers know that, I'm pretty sure, because it's their product, but the research community still knows very little about the impact of the game on potentially problematic gambling.
And Dr. Michael, hopefully we will have Jonathan back with us very shortly. But in your view, when we talk about product, one of the products which is still the most popular in the world, and actually we're about to see an increase in the US and Canada with this, is sports betting. And a lot of the information that we know about male sports bettors is very much based upon what we know from the UK, Australia, Europe, which is typically an older generation. What's your view? And it may be too early to be able to say with any degree of conviction or authority, but do you think we need to kind of revisit what we know about problematic play and sports betting for the digital generation?
Sure. I mean, of course, there is a big difference between, you know, in-play betting and pre-match gambling. Maybe, I don't know if Professor Griffith is still here. He could also join into the discussion if Jonathan doesn't make it back. And so I wanted a very interesting example. So me and Professor Griffith, we published a research in which we looked at, you know, the impacts of COVID on, for example, sports betting with a Swedish sample of players. And there, for example, of course, during the start of 2020, there were very limited events in Sweden or worldwide. And what we didn't see basically sports bettors convert to casino gambling at all. So there was basically no conversion from sports bettors to casino gambling. That's interesting, you know, because it sort of, at least it looks like that they were, I mean, at least this sample of players was a very specific group, which had little sort of, you know, connection over to casino gambling. And now with, I mean, the Dutch market only started a couple of days ago, but with those operators who will work there, we also see an interesting pattern. Who are the ones who come in and play the online casino very intensely compared to the ones they already have had before, mostly, of course, sports bettors. So that those, you know, introductions of a new registration, they are very good, you know, natural experiment for us.
So
and in sports betting, of course, they also.
Sorry, go on, sir.
Go ahead. Now, and
no,
one
I was
more
going
thing,
to say you raise a...
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, you raise a very interesting point. Historically, it's been a connection between sports betting and slots. What we've seen over the last, I guess, 12 to 24 months is the rise of virtual sports, which is, I guess, slots for sports players. And we've also seen the emergence of esports. And certainly in some jurisdictions where physical sports or mainstream sports have been restricted by the pandemic, some of those sports bettors have moved towards esports.
Yep. I mean, I can't sort of comment on that. What I can say is we also published a research with horse bettors. And in that research, we were particularly interested in the reasons to gamble. So reasons to gamble, there are various, there is one basically standardized scale with a couple of questions. And the reasons to gamble are sort of, there are four latent factors. That's like, are you gambling mostly to win money? Are you gambling to relax? Are you gambling to cope with, stress as a coping strategy? and are you gambling for social reasons, right? So those four. And we had the opportunity with sports betting operator, online and land-based, where everything is tracked, to submit this questionnaire to a large number of their players, because we're mostly interested what are the main motivating factors for, you know, those players. And we found winning money wasn't it. So basically, winning money wasn't the most popular factor. And we also found that relaxation and coping as a strategy were intermingled. So basically, the most problematic players were the who spent, of course, the most, who also said they have problems with gambling, were the ones who said they play on the one hand to relax, on the other hand also to cope with their problems. So that was basically the group of players who also scored high on PGSI questions, and not the ones who said they play actually to make money or make a living or win money. And then, of course, it's also interesting when it comes to, you know, addressing the players, developing strategies, you know, to communicate, to mitigate harm among those group of horse bettors.
Gosh, Michael, can I ask you then, because based on what you just said, one of the chief motivators is kind of escapism. It's moving away from reality and finding something that allows them to forget.
Yeah.
But so much of what we do as operators is based upon financial behaviors and triggers. But what you're saying is actually a winning player could be a problem gambler because it's not the money that is driving them.
Yes, so it's interesting what you're mentioning, because I can tell you of another research that we're currently doing. And there we looked basically into metrics which just describe somebody's gambling. You know, how often do you deposit? How often do you deposit on average in a session? Do you play during the day or during the nighttime? What's the average session length? So all metrics which are, except for how much did you actually lose, how much did you deposit, how much did you wager? So just, you know, behavioral metrics. And on the other hand, we were looking into metrics like the actual loss, the actual deposit, the actual wager. And we tried to figure out, you know, we tried to predict sort of future self-exclusion. And we found that you don't need to know how much somebody actually loses, how much somebody actually deposits, how long somebody actually gambles, but you only need to know the way they gamble, you know? Like, do they deposit in sessions multiple times? What kind of, you know, payment methods are they using? Do they gamble during the day and during the night? And I think that's important, because it also means to some extent that you can apply findings, algorithms, research to different areas. Because, for example, now let's say in Germany we have those 1,000 euros deposit limit a month. Still, you will have problematic gamblers, right? But if you would apply like you know, a monetary type of threshold algorithm, then nobody is problematic there, because they simply can't lose as much as elsewhere. Or if you look into Sweden, where you have the weekly deposit limit of the 5,000, I think, Swedish crowns, and more countries, jurisdictions are introducing those kinds of limits. And you need to look, you know, in order to sort of detect problematic play, you need to look at behavioral aspects. I think he's
Brilliant.
back. Jonathan,
Thank
are you back?
you so much, Michael. I think we have Jonathan back, so we're going to hand back to Jonathan. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Christina. So I guess I was talking to myself for the last 20 minutes. So how much time do you have? How much time do we have then?
If you could maybe just go back to where we were, because what you have to say is so valuable.
And where were we before I disappeared?
Go back to the second slide.
Yeah.
Second, can you go back a slide? No, before. Yeah, okay. We started to talk.
Okay.
You started to talk about the next slide.
Christina, give me a time frame to fit this into, and I'll get it done by then.
Is 5 minutes enough, sir? Are you still there, Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
You're dipping in and out, so let's see what we can do. If you just want to crack on with your presentation, let's see how far we get.
Okay, I do apologize. I got a special cable and everything set up, so I'm not sure what's going on. But let me continue on. What I was saying was this is a nice compliment to what Michael's talking.
Jonathan, it may be helpful if you turn your webcam off, perhaps, and we just go with audio. Thank you.
Okay, good idea. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can.
Brilliant. Okay. So I was just mentioning that this is a nice complement to what Michael was talking about. He's talking about assessing risk based on the behavior of the player. What we're interested in here, and has had a lot less research policy consideration, is assessing the product features, product platform, to consider what are the ways that you can target player protection strategies around that. So importantly then, and again, I'll go through this as quickly as I can, so that still makes sense though. I think a lot of over the last 2 years, there's been more and more focus on product risk. And I think there's some discussion, and there's certainly the view that the shift towards looking at product risk is that traditional responsible gambling, player tracking, interaction and intervention aren't as effective as they should be. And a lot of that's debatable. You have a range of different views from all different stakeholders in this. But I think from my perspective, there's definitely been a lot of development over the last 10 years. But equally, when you look at the evidence, there's still a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of player tracking, interventions, and demonstrating that's effective. As a consequence, point number 3 there, having to assess and manage product risk is becoming more and more important. So for example, in the Netherlands and in other jurisdictions are considering this, to get a license, you have to, and I think one of the speakers this morning was talking about this, to get a license and keep that license, you have to demonstrate that you know where the risks are coming from for the products in your portfolio, and not just that, be able to put together an action plan for how you're going to mitigate those risks. And I'm going to talk about different types of mitigation shortly. Assessing and mitigation risks is very challenging, and there's lots of reasons for that, but there's probably the 3 most important. It's probably the least well understood area in gambling studies. Secondly, products in the gambling industry change and develop at a rapid pace, a high level of innovation. And when you look at academia, when you look at government, it's very, and policymakers, it's very difficult to keep pace with that rapid change. You know, a piece of research could take 2 years. Next thing you know, that type of feature or that product might not even exist in its current form. So that's a challenge. I think probably one of the biggest challenges is that what makes a game fun and exciting is also the same thing that makes it risky or harmful or potentially addictive. So how do you tease that apart? I won't go into what various options exist out there in terms of protocols for assessing risk, but we recently published a paper, myself and Paul Del Fabro. It's in the slide there, and some people can email me if they want to have a copy of it. But in a nutshell, we argue that not the risk factors that are being looked at, we don't think they're all relevant. Some relevant ones aren't included in these protocols. Some of these protocols are out of date, and some of these protocols are very difficult to use and interpret. And who's interpreting them? Who's using them? Are they objective on both sides of the argument, either industry or those who are trying to demonstrate that these products are very addictive? So what level of objectivity do we have? So very quickly, this is a snapshot. This is a visual image of what research is telling us in the field. And if I can describe it as quickly as I can, each dot is a ranking for the product in terms of risk based on studies. So we reviewed the studies looking at product risk using survey data. And as you can see there, that slots come out on top in terms of the highest risk, ranked towards number 1, right down to lottery as being ranked as the least addictive or potentially harmful towards 8, 9, and 10. Now, most of that research has looked at a combination of land-based and online types of products, but also they looked at self-report measures, from survey data. And we wanted to look at A, all online products, and B, looking at behavioral track data, what are people actually doing? And what I'm going to go through now, just in a couple of slides, is our preliminary findings from just a couple of weeks of a collaboration that we're doing with Paul Del Fabro and Maris Catania at Kindred, who very kindly and bravely engaged us and give us access to their data and to their product teams. So what are we looking at? Well, an odds ratio in this sense is, if you look at racing, that has an odds ratio of 4.0. And that essentially means that if you had gambled on a racing event at least once over the last 6 months, you're 4 times more likely to be flagged as being at risk using Kindred's behavioral algorithm for detection, what they call the PSEDS. So you can see that racing and slots are coming out on top. Uncommon types of sports and esports coming out higher than the general category of sports, right the way down to bingo. I think what interested us is that we found that mini games, and a mini game is a slot game that you can play at the same time as a bingo. And if you look at it, this type of slot is much less risky using these data and these criteria than the slots you can play while playing bingo. And typically, from a theoretical point of view, you would expect it to be the opposite, where you can play slot games and gamble simultaneously on 2 different games. You would expect that to be higher risk. The next slide is taking these same odds ratios, but this looks quite convoluted, this image, but really what it's showing you is the bigger the circle is, the greater the level of participation. The darker the circle, the higher the odds ratio. So it's looking at level of participation in relation to risk. So while racing is higher risk, it's also got a very low level of participation, so 0.2%. And the products I've circled here, they are higher risk, but they're also much higher levels of participation. So when you go back to your licensing obligations, you have to think, and there's so much work to do here if this is the direction that, from a regulatory point of view, we're going to go in. And so what you have to then do is prioritize your resources in terms of research, in terms of safer gambling strategy. So this idea of burden of risk is an important place to look. So it's not just about how risky is it, it's how is it affecting the player base. So this final slide, again, just very quickly, from the data that we had, we didn't have an extensive data in this first study, but looking at sub-variations within the product vertical. So for example, when you look at the empirical academic research, you tend to find that pre-match betting on sports tends to be lower risk than in-play betting. And indeed, as you can see at the bottom there, that's what we found. What was interesting here, though, was that we didn't find it for racing. So pre-match race betting wasn't particularly more risky, again, using these data and these risk criteria that compared to other forms of race betting. I think the takeaway from this slide is just to emphasize the fact, and it's often ignored, even from policymakers, is the importance not just to look at the broad category membership of a product. It's about the different sub-variations within that product. Not all, in other words, not all sports bets are equal. Not all slots are equal in terms of their potential risk. And so that's important. This is a 3-year collaboration with Kindred. And as I say, we're really just 3 weeks into it. So we're just scratching the surface. But needless to say, from my perspective, I think that there's still an awful lot that needs to be done to understand where the risks are coming from before you can start to mitigate them. But that being said, let me move on to the final slide. If that was assessment, what do we do when we feel confident that we found or detected risk in a product or a feature or platform? And I'm aware of the fact that I will need to wrap it up. Let me just make some broad comments. So anybody who's interested in this and wants to get more detail, again, we've done a paper on this, myself, Paul Del Fabro, Simo Dragicevic, Chris Percy, Richard Bayless. I can send a copy of it. But this slide is just showing a wide range of ways that you can try to target product-related risk. So let me give you five or six very broad considerations to take away with you. I think the first thing is that product and platform restrictions tends to be where the main focus is at the minute, particularly from campaign groups, politicians. I know here in the UK, we had a House of Lords committee report, and one of the recommendations was that products should be tested for risk, with the most risky products being banned from entering the market. You have that all the way on one side, all the way through to what some people might say are softer or less restrictive forms of product risk mitigation. So a few points here. One, there's been very little academic research showing how effective any of these are in mitigating risk in real life. I think the second thing to say is that product and platform restrictions take a very long time to implement. And even when you've implemented them, it takes a very long time to change them if you've got them wrong. Without going into the merits or the limitations of the £2 stake on FOBTs here in the UK, whatever way you look at it, it took 10 years of campaigning to get it in. And if we don't think it's working, I don't know how difficult it would be to change. So what's my point? My point is it's very important to get this right. I think one of the problems is that sometimes industry are being charged with using that as an excuse for an action. And I think there's probably some truth to that. But it's still the reality of the situation. There's still so much that we don't know. And there's a lot at stake in terms of resources, in terms of time, in terms of cost, of making restrictions where we don't have enough evidence that they're actually going to work. I think one of the other challenges that we have is if you restrict a feature or if you restrict a product, how likely is it that a player will migrate to a different operator or a different jurisdiction? And as I said, if you're looking at product restrictions, are you going to affect the game to the point where nobody even wants to play it? And again, what are the implications for going and playing in a black market, for example? Final point I'd make is while I do think, it sounds like I'm not in favor of product restrictions. On the contrary, I think where we have a good idea where there's risk, I think it could be a very useful approach that you use in combination with other player safeguards and forms of interaction and intervention. And I don't have time, and maybe we have time in the discussion section, but just one example is choice architecture. I mean, here you have a situation where the vast majority, or at least where I go and play and try them out, you have a big deposit button right on the front of the screen to deposit money. And you still have to move to 3 or 4 menus if you want to withdraw money. And there are numerous other kind of choice architecture examples where it feels like it's pushing the player in a direction of spending more money as opposed to being able to withdraw their money. So I'll wrap it up there, but there's lots of issues to consider there. And if we have time, maybe we can discuss at the end here.
Well, I think regrettably, we are running out of time. And what you've just kind of presented to the audience, I think, as you've kind of said, you're only 3 weeks into this collaboration. This is very much the start of the conversation. As one of the observers pointed out, you compare racing with something like football. In some ways, they may all be fruit, but one is an apple, one is an orange. Horse race is typically shorter, a different kind of customer demographic, different kind of customer interest level and mindset. So I think what would be really interesting is to maybe come back in 3 months' time and see how much more data you have and whether it's perhaps changed your initial kind of slides 2, 3, and 4. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this session and time is not our friend. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and to you, Michael. And thank you to the MBA for putting on what has been an absolutely fantastic conference. Thank you very much. Back to you, Lady Chairwoman.
Thanks to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three for such a great presentation and great moderating. Thank you.